He preached forgiveness. He offered blessings. His voice, calm and honeyed, soothed the grieving and guided the lost. To the world, Father Daniel Moore was the embodiment of holiness, a man wrapped in devotion and moral clarity. The congregation adored him. Children hugged his knees after Sunday. Massachusetts elderly parishioners kissed his hand with reverence. He and his elegant wife, Agnes, lived in the rectory beside St. Mark's Chapel, their marriage admired as a testament to faith and fidelity. But behind the closed doors of the rectory, far from the pulpit and the choir's hymns, lived a quieter truth. And within that truth was a secret so foul, it would rot everything it touched. When Agnes left for an extended business trip overseas, 2 months in Brussels for a high-level charity summit, Father Daniel was left to manage the home. For the first 2 weeks after Agnes left for Brussels, Father Daniel Moore maintained his usual rhythm, rising early for prayer, preparing his Sunday sermons, counseling troubled parishioners, and overseeing minor renovations at the rectory. The house felt hollow without his wife's presence, but he chalked it up to loneliness, nothing more. Then came Maria. Hired to help maintain the house while Agnes was away, Maria was quiet, modest, and soft-spoken. She rarely made eye contact at first, always addressing Father Daniel as Sir or Father. She was only 22, but had seen hardship. Her parents died when she was a child, and she had bounced from one institution to another before finally landing the domestic job through a church-run charity initiative. At first, their interactions were polite and professional, but it wasn't long before subtle shifts crept in. One evening, Maria accidentally broke a wine glass in the kitchen and burst into tears, overwhelmed by fear of being dismissed. Father Daniel consoled her gently, touching her shoulder, then her back. She flinched at first, but when he didn't withdraw, she leaned into the comfort. From then on, boundaries began to blur. The late-night chats in the kitchen lasted longer. He asked questions about her life, her childhood, her dreams. She answered shyly, but grew more relaxed. One evening, they shared dinner at the kitchen table instead of in separate rooms. A week later, he poured 2 glasses of wine, claiming it was harmless. That night, he told her she had a pure heart and kind eyes. She blushed. He didn't stop himself when he leaned in. It was the first time Maria had ever been kissed, and it wasn't the last. What followed was an entanglement born out of secrecy, power, and misplaced trust. Father Daniel would lead Mass in the morning, then come home in the evening and fall into Maria's arms. He told himself it was temporary. He told her it was love. But above all, he made one thing clear. This is just between us. No one can ever know. If the church finds out, it'll be the end for both of us. Maria nodded, but deep down, a part of her wondered, was this love, or was she being used? Weeks passed. The affair continued behind locked doors and muffled whispers. They were careful, or so they thought. What Father Daniel didn't know was that the church janitor, an older man named Brother Eli, had begun to notice unusual behavior. Daniel seemed agitated lately, short-tempered, distracted during confessions. And Maria, once a humble housemaid, had started appearing in church corridors when she wasn't supposed to be there. One evening, as Brother Eli passed the chapel, he glanced up at the stained glass window. He paused. There, through the soft candle glow and kaleidoscope of colors, he saw a silhouette, a man's hands on a woman's hips, inside the rectory prayer room. He froze, watched, then quietly walked away, eyes wide, lips pressed shut. Back in the rectory, Maria began to change. She was no longer just quiet and meek. She was now anxious, uncertain. One night, while Daniel sat in his study, she approached him, pale and shaking. "I need to tell you something," she said, voice trembling. "I'm pregnant." Silence. His heart stopped, then pounded violently. He looked at her, eyes wide, searching her face for a lie. But there was none. "That can't happen," he whispered. "It mustn't." "I'm scared," she said, beginning to cry. "I didn't know who else to tell." Daniel panicked. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a disaster. A ticking time bomb. A scandal that could destroy his ministry, his reputation, and the church itself. So he did the only thing he could think of. "We'll take care of it," he said, slipping an envelope of money into her hands. "But it has to be soon. No one can know. Ever." Maria nodded. She took the money, said she understood. A week passed. She didn't go to any clinic. Instead, She returned with more fear in her eyes and a new request. They said there might be complications, she told him. I need more, maybe 500 more. His face darkened, but he complied. Then it happened again the following week, and again the week after. Each time he paid, she offered vague excuses, claimed she was still considering it. But the truth was, she never intended to get rid of the baby. This pregnancy, this secret, was her only weapon, and she could sense Daniel's fear growing. With every envelope, she realized she held more power than she ever had in her life. But that power came at a cost. Father Daniel could no longer sleep. He grew more irritable. He found himself snapping at church staff, stumbling through scripture, forgetting appointments. Behind closed doors, he began drinking, something he hadn't done since seminary. He paced at night, sometimes whispering prayers, other times arguing with himself. And all the while, Maria continued to ask for money, each time with a softer voice and colder eyes. It wasn't about greed anymore. It was control. And Daniel, the man who wore a cross each day and spoke of salvation, began to wonder, how much more can I give before everything I've built collapses? By the time the calendar turned to week 7 of Agnes's absence, the rectory no longer felt like a house of God. The sacred hush that once defined its halls had been replaced by heavy silences, muffled arguments, and the creak of guilt-ridden footsteps. The rose garden Agnes loved so dearly had begun to wither under Father Daniel's neglect. And Maria, no longer the wide-eyed, soft-spoken maid, had turned into someone else entirely. She had grown bold. That Thursday night, she stood in the kitchen doorway holding her belly and declared with a certainty that made Father Daniel's blood run cold, I'm keeping the baby, and you're going to tell your wife. Or I will. Father Daniel stood in stunned silence, his fingers tightening around the rosary beads in his pocket. For weeks, he had been dancing on the edge of ruin, paying her off, feeding her lies, hoping she would quietly disappear into the night. But she hadn't, and she wouldn't. Now, she wanted acknowledgement, legitimacy, and she wasn't afraid anymore. Maria, he whispered, voice raw, please, you don't understand what this could do. To me, to the church, to my wife. Please, don't ruin everything. She didn't flinch. You ruined everything the moment you touched me. Now, I'm just making sure you take responsibility. Then she turned, and in her usual quiet voice, she added, you have until tonight. I want the truth to come from you. Or I'll go to the bishop, to your wife, to the press. I don't care anymore. That night, something inside Father Daniel snapped. He walked into the chapel after midnight. Alone, he knelt at the altar in complete darkness. The red glow of the sanctuary candle flickered like the eye of something watching. He folded his hands, closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, prayed not for guidance, but for permission. Lord, you know my heart. You know I didn't mean for any of this. But I can't let her destroy everything. I won't. You chose me to lead your flock, and I will not let a mistake. And your mission. Outside the chapel, Brother Eli had returned late from a hospital visit. As he walked past the heavy wooden doors, he paused, hearing whispers. Not prayers. Desperate, broken whispers echoing off stone and glass. He pressed his ear to the door. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. The next morning, Maria was gone. Her bed unslept in. Her phone left on the dresser. Her clothes still folded neatly in the laundry basket. No goodbye note. No messages. Just an eerie, unnatural stillness. Father Daniel called no one. He walked into the church at precisely 8:45 a.m. and adjusted his collar. By 9 a.m., he was standing behind the pulpit, smiling serenely as he welcomed the congregation. Bless you all, my children. Today's homily is about the importance of truth and the mercy of silence. He preached with renewed energy. His hands didn't tremble. His voice didn't waver. But Brother Eli, sitting in the third pew, watched him closely. Something was different. Too calm. Too clean. After Mass, a few members noticed Maria's absence. She must have left early, Daniel said smoothly. Family emergency. She didn't say much. The explanation was accepted without question, at first. But as the days passed and Maria didn't return, murmurs began to rise like incense smoke. Agnes called to ask how things were going, and Daniel's voice stayed even. Fine, he said. Quiet, but fine. And yet, the chapel began to feel colder. Every time Father Daniel stepped inside, the flicker of candlelight felt accusing. The confession booth, where sinners poured out their guilt, now seemed like a tomb with secrets carved into its walls. It was in that booth, just 2 nights later, where he found the second whisper of danger. He had just finished evening prayers when someone slipped in, unseen, and took the other side of the confessional. No greeting, just a voice. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Daniel straightened, surprised. "Speak freely, my child. I know what you did." The air in the confessional froze. "Excuse me. Maria didn't run away, did she?" Silence. "You think no one's watching. But confession isn't always a safe place." Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He flung open the curtain. Empty. The person had vanished. He stumbled back, pale, suddenly unsure if it had even been real. But the whisper lingered. Confession isn't always a safe place. By the time Agnes Moore returned from her business trip abroad, the house smelled faintly of incense and cleaning polish. Daniel had made sure of that. Everything was in its place. Fresh flowers in the vase, her favorite tea on the kitchen counter, and not a single trace of Maria. "She left," he explained gently when Agnes asked. "Said her aunt in Charleston fell gravely ill. Didn't want to be a burden, so she packed up in the middle of the night." Agnes frowned. "She didn't even leave a note?" "Said she'd write when she settled." "I don't think she was happy here, Agnes." She seemed distant toward the end. Agnes didn't ask again. She trusted her husband. After all, Daniel was the town's most beloved priest, a man of dignity, compassion, and truth. Or so she believed. But 3 days later, someone showed up at the chapel who would threaten to unravel everything. She was young, with sharp eyes and a tense posture. She wore a faded jean jacket and clutched a crumpled photo of Maria. "I'm Elena, Maria's cousin. I've been trying to reach her. She was supposed to visit her aunt, but she never showed up." Daniel's expression didn't flicker. He invited her in, offered her tea, and calmly repeated the story. Maria had left voluntarily, said goodbye, took her things, mentioned her aunt, and left in the night. No drama, no confrontation. "You know how Maria was," he added with a soft, fatherly tone. Quiet, kept her feelings to herself. Maybe she needed to go her own way. Elena didn't nod. She didn't sip her tea. Instead, she looked around the rectory with a slow, calculating gaze. "Did she leave anything behind?" "Not that I'm aware of," Father Daniel said quickly. But Elena noticed something, a brief flicker in his eyes, a slight shift in his tone. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She returned later that evening, under the guise of wanting to look for a missing locket Maria always wore. Agnes, unaware of any reason to suspect trouble, allowed her inside. She even offered to help. "Maria was like family to us," Agnes said, smiling warmly. She loved this place. As they moved through the house, Elena kept her eyes peeled. A scarf, a toothbrush, a single earring, anything that might prove Maria hadn't left willingly. But the place had been scrubbed clean, almost too clean. Then, in the priest's bedroom, while Agnes stepped away to answer a call, Elena dropped to the floor beside the bed. Something had glinted under the edge of the frame, tucked between the wooden slats and the floorboard. It was small, familiar. Maria's rosary. The same delicate pink-beaded rosary Maria never took off, not even to sleep. Elena's heart thundered in her chest. She carefully pulled it out, held it in shaking hands, then reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Click. She took a photo of the rosary in her hand, the priest's bed visible in the background. She didn't say a word to Agnes. She didn't confront Father Daniel. She simply tucked the beads into her pocket, thanked them both, and left. But Father Daniel saw her from the window as she walked away. She wasn't just leaving. She was marching. Determined. Purposeful. He turned back toward his room and realized something was missing. The rosary. He closed his eyes, rage and fear knotting inside him like barbed wire. He thought he had erased everything. Every trace. Every risk. But a shallow grave doesn't keep secrets forever. Out in the woods behind the rectory, near the old fence line where no one ever walked, beneath a twisted cedar tree, the earth had recently been disturbed, covered with branches and loose soil. The rain hadn't come yet, but when it did, it would expose more than dead leaves. It would expose the truth. Agnes Moore had always considered herself an observant woman. In her marriage to Father Daniel, she had learned to read the smallest of signs, his quiet sighs, the way his fingers twitched during prayer, the rare but telling silences between his words. But something had changed since her return. Her husband was still kind, still polished in his demeanor, but there was a tightness to his smile now, a dullness in his eyes. He spoke with reverence from the pulpit, but kept glancing over his shoulder when he thought no one was watching. And then there was Maria. The girl's sudden disappearance didn't sit right with her. Maria had always been thoughtful, gentle. She wasn't the kind to vanish without a word. No call, no goodbye, no forwarding address. Did she even pack her things? Agnes asked aloud one day. Daniel was in the study. She didn't expect an answer, and he didn't give one. The first Real crack appeared one afternoon while Agnes was taking out the trash. It had rained heavily the night before, and the bin had toppled over behind the house. As she stooped to pick up soggy papers and food wrappers, something pink caught her eye wedged between the trash bag and the bin wall. A pregnancy test box. Empty. Torn open. She stared at it, a chill crawling up her arms despite the spring air. It wasn't hers, and it couldn't have been from one of the women in the congregation. No one used their private trash bin. It could have only belonged to Maria. Agnes stood there for a long moment, rainwater dripping from her fingertips, her mind racing. She didn't want to believe what was now slowly uncoiling in her imagination. Not Daniel, not her husband, not the priest the entire town adored. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed beside him, listening to the subtle rise and fall of his breathing, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Around 1:30 a.m., he stirred, rose quietly. She watched from the corner of her eye as he slipped on his robe and left the room, barefoot. Agnes followed. She stayed in the shadows of the hall as he moved through the house, past the kitchen, through the side door into the church. He entered the confessional booth. Agnes stepped silently into the sanctuary and crouched behind the pews, heart pounding. Inside the booth, she heard him whisper, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." There was a long pause. "I didn't mean to. I never wanted to hurt her." Another pause. But she wouldn't stop. She kept threatening me. She wanted more and more. And I couldn't let her ruin everything. Agnes covered her mouth to muffle the gasp that nearly escaped. Her knees weakened beneath her. She said she would tell you, in the church. Silence again. Then a single, broken sentence. "I buried her. Oh God, I buried her." Agnes slipped out of the church like a ghost, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind screamed, but her feet kept moving. Back to the house. Into the bedroom. Into bed. When Daniel returned moments later, she feigned sleep. But sleep never came. The next day, she didn't confront him. She watched instead. Watched how he carefully avoided any mention of Maria. Watched how he flinched every time someone mentioned her name in passing. Then, on a quiet afternoon 2 days later, she walked out into the garden. The one Maria used to tend so lovingly. It hadn't been touched in weeks. The soil was lumpy, uneven. A section near the fence looked disturbed, recently turned. Agnes grabbed a spade. With trembling hands, she began to dig, shallow at first, then deeper. The scent of damp earth filled her nostrils. Her hands became blistered, her breaths ragged. Then a sound, a faint crack. The spade had hit something solid. She dropped to her knees and clawed with her fingers, pushing dirt aside until she saw it. A strip of fabric. Pale blue, dirty, stiff with soil. And beneath it, something soft, unnatural. Before she could uncover more, a sudden crack of a twig behind her made her jump. She turned sharply. No one there. But she felt it. Someone was watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. She covered the hole quickly with her hands, heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know what terrified her more, what she'd found, or who might already know that she had found it. Later that night, she found Daniel sitting alone in the study, rosary in hand, his lips moving silently. "Who have you become?" she whispered from the doorway. Daniel looked up, startled. He opened his mouth to speak, but said nothing. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes hollow. "I know," she said, "and I'm not the only one." She turned and walked away. It rained for 3 straight days. Not a gentle drizzle, but an unrelenting, pounding storm that soaked the little town to its roots. Gutters overflowed, tree limbs cracked and fell, and the earth itself seemed to heave beneath the weight of the water. Behind the church rectory, the garden, once a carefully tended space full of herbs and flowers, had turned into a muddy basin. The soil, disturbed weeks earlier, could no longer hold its secrets. On the morning of the 4th day, Mrs. Lennox, a neighbor 2 houses down, let her terrier, Max, into the yard. Normally, he'd bark at squirrels or chase his tail, but today he bolted toward the edge of the church property, nose to the ground. Seconds later, the barking changed. It was sharp, urgent, unnatural. When Mrs. Lennox found him, Max was pawing furiously at a sunken patch of wet dirt just outside the fence. Something pale and grotesque jutted out from the mud, a hand. Not a stick, not a bone. A human hand, its skin waxy, fingers stiff with death. She screamed, loud enough for the mailman to hear, loud enough that within the hour, police tape circled the entire property. Agnes watched it all from the kitchen window. Her hands trembled against her teacup. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She already knew. The discovery sent shockwaves through the parish. Churchgoers gasped and whispered, reporters showed up at the gates, and parish council members, wide-eyed and pale, called emergency meetings. The police unearthed the full body late that afternoon. The decomposition was advanced, but the clothing, dental records, and a necklace confirmed what many feared. The body was Maria, and in her small suitcase, recovered from a hidden crawl space beneath the rectory floorboards, they found something that changed everything. A sealed envelope, marked in careful handwriting. To Mrs. Agnes Moore. Detective Ramirez handed it to her personally. "We found this among her things," he said. "It's addressed to you. We thought you should read it before we log it into evidence." Agnes's hands shook as she broke the seal. The letter inside was short, but every word burned. "Dear Mrs. Moore, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. It wasn't an accident. I didn't run away. It was Father Daniel. He said if I didn't keep quiet, he'd lose everything. His ministry, his wife, his reputation. He said no one would believe me anyway. But I needed to tell someone. You were always kind to me. I thought maybe, someday, you'd want to know the truth. I'm scared. I don't know what he's capable of. But if anything happens to me, it was him. Maria." Agnes read the letter again and again as the world around her fell away. The man she had loved, the man she had defended, the man who had held her hand in prayer for over a decade, had murdered a girl in cold blood, and lied, buried her like trash in their garden, preached sermons while the weight of sin hung heavy in the soil outside. That evening, Father Daniel returned home, soaked from the rain, his coat dripping as he stepped inside. He stopped short when he saw her at the table, the letter in her hand, the look in her eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. Agnes stood slowly. "She trusted me," she said, voice low and cold. "And you buried her feet for my roses." He tried to explain, plead, manipulate. But for the first time, she didn't listen. Minutes later, the police entered through the front door. They didn't knock. "Father Daniel Moore," the detective said, "you are under arrest for the murder of Maria Alvarez." As the cuffs clicked shut, Agnes didn't cry. She just watched. The truth had surfaced, because the dead don't stay buried forever. And justice? Justice had finally begun. The press dubbed it the sacrament scandal. Headlines screamed, "Priest accused of murdering housemaid." Church of Shadows. What did Father Daniel do? Inside the gray walls of the police interrogation room, Father Daniel Moore sat rigid in his clerical collar, arms folded tight. The calm charisma he once exuded from the pulpit had drained from his face, replaced by tension and sweat. The room was too cold, or perhaps his lies had finally chilled him to the bone. Across the table, Detective Ramirez leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "We found the body. We found the letter. Tell us what happened." Daniel licked his lips. His voice cracked. "She was obsessed with me. She wouldn't leave me alone. She fabricated the whole thing, said she was pregnant to manipulate me. I never touched her." Ramirez arched an eyebrow. "You're saying she made it all up?" "Yes. She was trying to ruin my life." But as the words left his mouth, the door opened. A younger officer stepped in and handed the detective a file and a flash drive. Ramirez plugged it in and pressed play. A shaky voice, familiar and young, echoed from the small recorder. He said no one would believe me. He said if I didn't stay quiet, he'd make me disappear. I thought he cared about me. But I think he's dangerous. It was Maria's voice. Clear, terrified, heartbreaking. The audio had been provided by Elena, Maria's cousin, who had secretly recorded her during one of their last late-night conversations. She'd hesitated to come forward until the body was found, until justice was no longer optional. Ramirez watched Father Daniel carefully. The priest's expression didn't crumble. It hardened. Anyone can fake a voice. That's not proof of anything. But the web was unraveling fast, and lies don't hold forever. Forensics had already found traces of chloroform on Maria's clothes, and bruising consistent with manual strangulation. But what changed everything was the blood. Just a few faint smears, barely visible, behind the church altar, half scrubbed with bleach. Under UV light, the stains glowed. DNA confirmed what they feared. Maria had been killed inside the church. The garden was never the crime scene. It was only the final chapter. The murder had taken place in the sanctuary, the sacred heart of their community. Ramirez tossed the photographs on the table. Images of the blood spatters, bleach bottles, even torn pieces of Maria's dress found behind the confessional curtain. She bled on holy ground, he said, voice low. This wasn't a moment of panic. This was calculated. You cleaned the scene, buried the body, told the congregation she left for her sick aunt. You stood in that same pulpit the next morning and preached about mercy. Father Daniel stared at the photographs for a long moment, then whispered, "She was going to destroy me." There it was. The truth, bitter and small, spilling from between his lips like ash. She said she'd tell Agnes. Tell the church. Tell everyone. She said she wouldn't stop until I was nothing. His voice trembled, not from guilt, but from fear. Not for what he'd done, but for what he'd lost. "So you silenced her?" Ramirez asked. The priest said nothing. He simply looked away. Outside the police station, the town buzzed with disbelief. Parishioners wept. Some refused to accept it. Others demanded accountability. Agnes, pale and composed, stepped forward to the crowd of reporters and murmured one sentence. He killed her where she prayed. That night, the church doors were locked for the first time in years. And the town's faith, once held tight in Father Daniel's sermons, now searched for shelter and truth. Inside a quiet, windowless holding cell, Father Daniel sat hunched on the edge of his cot. His once pristine clerical collar was gone, replaced with the dull gray of a county jumpsuit. His Bible lay untouched beside him. But it wasn't prayer he whispered under his breath now. It was blame. When Detective Ramirez entered the room for what would be their final conversation, Father Daniel didn't look up. "Are you here for my confession?" he asked bitterly. Ramirez remained silent, placing a recorder gently on the table. "Make it count," the detective said. And Father Daniel did. He spoke not with sorrow, but with resentment. Not remorse, but righteousness twisted by delusion. "I was chosen, called, anointed. But God, He tested me. She was the serpent, temptation in a house of purity. I fought it, for weeks. But she knew. She used it, dangled that sin in front of me like an apple. She would have ruined everything. I had no choice." He paused, eyes wild now, hands trembling. "I killed the sin before it spread." Ramirez leaned in, eyebrows furrowed. "You killed a woman. I saved the ministry." But Ramirez had heard enough. He turned off the recorder and stepped out of the room. There was more to this story, and it was darker than anyone knew. That evening, as the police scoured Daniel's home for more evidence, a discovery cracked open years of silence. In the back of his private study, behind a false panel in his desk, Agnes found a thin, leather-bound journal, weathered and hidden beneath piles of sermon notes. Her hands shook as she opened it. October 13th. I cannot look at her without shame. She moves through the house like a ghost with a smile. I pray, but desire drowns me. October 29th. She said she would tell my wife. I warned her. I begged her. November 2nd. I saw the devil in her eyes. It wasn't just about Maria. Pages stretched back for years. Other names. Other entries. Notes about a former housemaid named Clarice, who left suddenly after a sinful incident. Agnes's blood ran cold. She hadn't thought of Clarice in years. The quiet, shy girl who worked for them 5 years ago and vanished without a word. Daniel had told her she'd left to care for her mother in another country. She had believed him. Now she knew better. When Agnes turned over the journal to Detective Ramirez, her voice was steady, but her eyes brimmed with betrayal. He wrote sermons by day and murder by night. The journal gave the police more than a confession. It gave them a pattern, a buried history of abuse, manipulation, lust, and guilt masked behind robes and rituals. There were no firm leads on Clarice yet, but the entry about her opened a cold case. And suspicions that Maria might not have been his only victim became a devastating possibility. The community, still reeling from the initial murder, now faced a deeper horror. Their priest hadn't fallen once. He had fallen many times. And for years, no one had seen it. Or worse, no one wanted to. When Father Daniel was told about the journal, he didn't react. He simply looked up at the crucifix on the wall of the interrogation room and muttered. Even Judas was once close to God. But unlike Judas, Daniel didn't hang himself in shame. He simply watched his world burn down in silence. And justice was coming. The congregation filled the pews that Sunday morning, unaware they were about to witness the final act of a man who had hidden evil behind Scripture. Father Daniel Moore stood at the altar, adorned in his ceremonial robes, hands raised to heaven. His voice rang out across the sanctuary. Let us begin with a reading from the Gospel of John. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. But just as the organ began its solemn hymn, the church doors creaked open with force. 2 uniformed officers entered, followed by Detective Ramirez, who walked down the aisle, not as a man of faith, but as a man of law. Gasps echoed. Confused whispers filled the air. Daniel froze. Father Daniel Moore, Ramirez said loud enough for all to hear. You are under arrest for the murder of Maria Alvarez and suspected involvement in prior disappearances. Step away from the altar. The priest's hands trembled. He looked around, perhaps hoping for support from the sea of faces that once adored him. But the faces were no longer reverent. They were horrified. Some wept. Others stood stunned. A few slowly stepped out of the pews, backing away from the man they had trusted with their souls. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Daniel whispered to Ramirez, "They'll never believe you." But outside, the crowd of reporters already had their cameras raised. They believed. The whole world would believe. Back home, Agnes packed in silence. The same house that had once been filled with warmth now reeked of betrayal. She had already filed for annulment, refusing to spend one more day legally tied to the man who had desecrated their marriage, their home, and their faith. In the bedroom drawer, she left behind her wedding ring with a note that read, "You wore the collar, but I see the wolf now." Meanwhile, Maria's cousin Elena sat in a lawyer's office, filing the paperwork to establish the Maria Foundation, an organization to protect domestic workers, especially immigrants, from abuse and exploitation. She was scared, Elena told the reporter later. She thought no one would believe her. But now, we'll make sure no woman like her ever feels alone again. The Foundation's first campaign, a hotline for maids, nannies, and caregivers, staffed by lawyers, therapists, and survivors. Justice for Maria would not end in a courtroom. It would live on in protection, in reform, and in truth. The town's church reopened weeks later, its pews half full, its congregation humbled. The old altar had been removed, and in its place, a single white candle burned beside a framed photograph of Maria. The flame flickered beneath the cross, a symbol not of Father Daniel's power, but of the lives he could not extinguish. Because in the end, he thought he could bury the truth. But even in death, Maria refused to stay silent. And justice, long buried behind robes and ritual, had finally stepped into the light.